Hey everyone. So welcome to my home office. You're going to be seeing me here a lot for the rest of the semester. I also have with me my two dogs, Penny and Lucy. Penny, she's like staying on the couch, so that's her. And then Lucy is super barky and will also make a guest appearance later. They bark sometimes. There's not much I can do about it. So there's that, right? So what I'm going to do in these short lectures is I really want to make sure that even if you don't have access to Zoom or you have problems meeting our synchronous meetings, that you get some of the main concepts that are important for understanding the reading and for doing well in the test and doing well in the paper, right? So I'm going to talk through some of the concepts that would have been like important for your in your textbook, right? So I'm going to pull out some of the key ones. So these are all about masculinity. So the first one is the patriarchy. And so you've probably like heard, smash the patriarchy, or like that's so patriarchal before or whatnot. Patriarchy actually has a really specific meaning, and it's a much older rule of society and of government. The patriarchy is literally the rule of the father. And it's specific to, for example, if you picture a really big family, be saying that the father, the highest status man in that household, is the one who's literally responsible for everyone else. So often the other members of the household, whether they be adult women, children, and other adult men who are family members who are not as high status, are considered to be his property in many ways. In fact, sometimes his legal property. One thing that happened with, for example, the development of child abuse laws and domestic violence and intimate partner violence laws was really challenging this rule of the father and saying like, well, just because these family members are your like property doesn't mean you can do as you want with them. So that's kind of, it's an important thing in terms of like looking at it in terms of not just all men having power, but high status men in particular having a disproportionate amount of power. Because if we look at, for example, during like sort of colonial times in the US, it wasn't that all men had power. It was that white householders had power, white men who had families, who owned land. It was a very small percentage of the population, but they had a disproportionate amount of power, not just over people in their household, but in terms of like government and society. They were considered to be sort of citizens, voters, and all that good stuff. So this is a particular kind of system that creates a gender hierarchy. Do we have a patriarchy now? Yes and no. Right? So we've talked about how if a woman wants to get a tubal ligation, she has to have her husband's permission. But if a man wants to get a vasectomy, the same thing isn't asked of him, right? So this is an example of kind of more power given to husbands and fathers. But some things have really changed, right? And we'll see that particularly when we look at the documentary we're going to see on second wave feminism. For example, women can open their own credit cards now and their own bank accounts, which used to be that women had to have a signature of either their father or their husband. So they're considered to be always supervised in some way by some sort of patriarchy. Patriarchal bargain. A little bit more complicated. This is more about how an individual navigates patriarchal power, right? Where an individual or group accepts or sometimes even legitimates some of the costs of the patriarchy in exchange for receiving some of its rewards. So for example, sometimes women's behavior or lower status men, they may support the power of high status men. Be like, oh, well, I'm gonna like reinforce this power for this person in my household, this person in my community, or support ideals that they'll never be able to live up to. Because they get some rewards out of it. They don't get all the full benefits, but they get some of the rewards. So I have a picture here of like sort of a white 1950s housewife, right, who didn't necessarily reap all of the benefits of her arrangement with sort of the white male breadwinner, who was considered the head of her household, but definitely legitimates it and definitely gets something out of it, right? One concept that I really wish that Pascoe would engage with more deeply in her book, which we're going to be spending a lot of time reading Pascoe's book. Oh, you can't really see this corner here. I'm going to minimize myself for a second, is androcentrism, which is a kind of gender-based prejudice. And it's very complicated. It's almost much more complicated than sexism. Right? Sexism, we're like, oh, it's a denigration of like sort of traits in people, right? This is the granting of higher status, respect, value, reward, and power to the masculine compared to the feminine. So here, let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. So it's sort of valuing masculinity more than femininity. So for example, when female bodies, people who are female assigned at birth, right, engage in masculine behavior, it's often rewarded or valued in particular ways, like they engage in sports, for example. If we look at how tomboys are treated as children, you know, when you Google tomboys, you get often some very positive images, endearing images of pre-adolescent girls in particular, where it's kind of a more allowable phase. Whereas if a boy is a sissy, if someone who's supposed to be masculine is embracing feminine traits, that's often heavily devalued. We can also see that in terms of occupations. So doctors and nurses both perform a lot of medical procedures, have to have a lot of medical knowledge, work really long hours, but doctors are often coded as very masculine, or a very masculine endeavor, and valued a lot more than women, coded as a very feminine endeavor. And what's interesting about the study of these sort of gender segregated occupations is that in countries where women are disproportionately doctors, they're not valued, right? So if it's considered to be a feminine endeavor, it's not valued in the same way. And we can see that for some things like cheerleading, which is a sport that used to be a men's sport. And now it's very coded as feminine. And men who engage in it, instead of being the leaders of the school, are coded as feminine men, right? So this androcentrism that says, like, you know, the masculinity of this feat is what's most valued, you know, that kind of shapes our attitudes towards it. Same thing with being a secretary. That used to be a very masculine role, or teacher, especially elementary school teachers, used to be a men's job, right? And when it became what we know about work and androcentrism is that when jobs become coded as feminine jobs, they're paid less. And it has nothing to do with the traits of the job itself, and everything to do with how we understand masculinity and femininity. So one thing that Pascoe talks about, and it's really kind of a reaction to in her book, is that a lot of masculinity studies focuses on this concept called hegemonic masculinity. And so we've talked about hegemony, right, as something that is sort of overwhelming ideological and kind of dominant sort of consensus around it. Hegemonic masculinity has been kind of the center, unfortunately, of masculinity theory. I'm also critical of it, because it's saying basically that within masculinity, there's a lot of hierarchies between the sort of idealized masculinity, right? And Pascoe says, well, what is that ideal masculinity? Like, who actually embodies that, right? Or is it just an idea of what that ideal should be? Someone who's athletic, smart, and violent, and, you know, sensitive, and all these different things. But it creates these like contestations and hierarchies between men who can meet this ideal and men who cannot. So there's a lot of theorizing about those contestations. Like, what about the men who are not hegemonic, which is most all of men, you know? And Pascoe is super critical of this way of understanding masculinity. So I think of the studies of hegemonic masculinity as often falling back on tropes like the sort of the nerd and the jock, right? Both men, both masculine. Being nerd is a type of masculinity, but one is definitely more valued than the other in terms of how masculinity is performed. So if Pascoe doesn't really like masculinity, what is her approach, right? We're going to be talking about this a little bit during our Zoom session, but if you can't make it for whatever reason, here's some of her main thoughts. One is Pascoe is really adamant that it's not just about male bodies. She says it's a mistake to think of masculinity as just that stuff that men do, you know? And she has a whole chapter on female masculinity, which we're going to read together next week. She also says sexuality is really important for understanding the construction of gender. We're not just talking about masculinity, we're talking about heterosexual masculinity and how it's constructed at high schools. She says masculinity is a process, it's interactional, it's a field through which power is articulated. So this is a little bit more complicated. We're gonna be really unpacking this in the next couple of weeks. It's a process, it's something that happens when boys interact with one another, when students interact with one another, and it's a field through which like power is shaped and articulated. So it's not just a neutral activity, how this interaction happens and how it's shaped. It is about power and who has power and who doesn't. And we'll see that it's not just a very simple narrative of like boys have power and girls don't. It's not that at all. It's saying that within boys, there's a lot of these sort of power relationships between boys.